Welcome everybody to this evening's, this month's July's photography talk by me, Nigel Hicks, a professional photographer based in the southwest of England. And we're going to be talking this evening about blurred motion photography, which basically means, as you can see in the introductory picture here, photographing things in such a way, or photographing primarily moving subjects in such a way that they blur in order to put over the feeling of movement and dynamism and energy and so on. Occasionally it is actually making a static object move and blurring that, but I'll show you a little bit about that towards the end of the show. Most of it is going to be about photographing things in such a way, or photographing moving objects in such a way that they blur to give the sense of movement. And you'll see, obviously, it's certainly an area of photography that I work in mostly. We use it a lot in landscape photography to blur moving water and vegetation and so on, and that's what at least half of this evening's presentation is going to show. That because it's going to concentrate on that kind of photography, but there will also be what you see here, sort of street photography and some other areas of blurred motion photography. But we'll start off with the landscape photography and push on with that. So I'm going to start off with a couple of images which I've sort of shown this view before initially, and you can see just a sort of standard view really of the Batalic tin mines in the far west of Cornwall, taken in a sort of late afternoon on a relatively windy day with big waves coming in. Although it's quite a sort of a dynamic scene, because I photographed it with a relatively fast shutter speed, the waves are completely frozen, so it sort of looks rather static. So we've rather lost the sense of movement and dynamism and the energy that the sea possessed as it was rolling in against the cliffs. So what I would want to do in this kind of situation is what I've done in the next shot. And the shutter speed in this instance, by the way, was 40th of a second. So it's not that fast, but it's fast enough to certainly from this distance, when viewed from this distance, at least sort of freeze the movement of these waves as they come in onto the rocks. But then what I've done later on, as the sun has got a little bit lower, I've then used a much slower shutter speed, is 0.6 of a second, and it's been slow enough to blur the movement of these waves here as they come in on the rocks. And that's given a much greater sense of energy and movement. And so you can really feel like this landscape is on the move. Well, that's not the land, obviously, but the sea that's coming in on it. And I think that's given us a much greater sense of movement. And so just a slower shutter speed, that's all you really need to do to actually blur the movements of your subject, is just use a slow shutter speed. Of course, how you actually execute that it can vary, because once you've got a slow shutter speed, then you really can't hand hold anymore. You've got to get the camera on a tripod or put it on some kind of steady surface, and then just fire away with long exposures. That does require you being able to shut, when the sun is still shining, that does require you being able to close the lens aperture down, of course. And this is f/22, which on the lens that I'm using here is the narrowest lens aperture that will go down to. And I got the ISO at its lowest setting, which on this camera, which is the Canon 5D Mark IV, is 50. So I've got the sensitivity set as low as I can. The lens aperture as narrow as we can, so letting as little light in as I possibly can. And I'm managing to get 0.6 of a second, which is sort of blurring out these waves as they come into the rocks. Obviously, one can slow it down still further by using filters, and most of what I'm going to show you this evening is actually deliberately without filters, so you can see how you can do this even without filters, provided you're shooting in relatively low light conditions, such as you get towards the end of the day. This is taken about 20 minutes before sunset, so we're getting down to the light levels are starting to get a little lower. Doesn't really show that much in the lighting on the cliffs, but certainly in terms of the shutter speed we're able to get, it's certainly starting to happen. Anyway, if we wait still longer until after the sun is set and we get into dusk, the light becomes much bluer, but now the exposure time becomes much longer, and we end up with the sea completely blurring out, and you get this really very milky, ethereal kind of look to it, sort of quite a misty appearance of the waves against the rocks. So this exposure time is 30 seconds. So f/18. So I've opened up the aperture slightly to stop the exposure time becoming too long, and the ISO is 100. So sort of letting a little bit more light in, but nevertheless still needing 30 seconds to actually expose this picture. Taken about 45 minutes or so after sunset. So it's well into dusk, but it's not day, not darkness as yet. But the picture you're seeing here is actually a lot lighter than the scene was when I was actually there. But using this really long exposure, as you can see, the waves are completely burned out, and you've just got this beautiful mist and quite a very moody atmospheric sort of shot. And we continue with the same sort of theme into this picture, which is again taken at dusk, again about 40-45 minutes after sunset, on the north coast of Devon. The difference between this shot and the previous one, the previous shot is quite blue, and that's because the sun is set off to the left of the camera and almost behind it. So that shot with Patalik, I was looking northwards. In this shot, I'm looking west, so I'm looking right into the light where the sun has set below the horizon. So I'm still got quite a bit of pink in the light here, so still picking up some reddish color. So the light is still quite, well, the color of the scene is still quite warm, but we've managed to sort of use a very slow shutter speed to actually blur this right out. This again is well, I say slow shutter speed. It's 10 seconds this time, so a lot faster than the previous shot, but nevertheless it's still long enough to completely blur the scene out. And lens aperture is closed right down at f/18, and we would again really have a really nice ethereal scene where the water's become completely milky, and it looks very like we've got a sort of a low mist over the water rather than actually Atlantic waves rolling in onto the rocks. So it's a very different kind of shot from what you might take during the afternoon when the sun is up and you can actually photograph the waves coming in. So it's a different sort of image altogether. Moving on a little bit further, again, still concentrating on the sea. And this is taken a little bit earlier, same location, or almost the same location, North Devon coast, Heartland, in the southwest of England. But here, the sun is obviously above the horizon, so we've got sunlight reflecting not just off the rocks, but off the water as well. And it's at 0.8 of a second. So with this faster shutter speed, you actually now see the water that swirls around and flies over the rocks. So it's a very different kind of blur we're getting. It's not the sort of completely milky, soft scene that we saw in the last two shots. It's this really much more staccato, not a staccato shot, but water is blurring out, but you can see the waves as they swirl around the rocks and create patterns in the water. So you can control the kind of blur you get in the pictures according to the sort of shutter speed you're using. And if you sort of just practice a bit with different shutter speeds, very long and a little bit faster, you can sort of decide on work out for yourself the different effects that you can get. And obviously, if you're not going to use filters to actually artificially darken the light coming into the lens, then you need to do it in different types of weather. So you can do it in the middle of the day if you've got really dull, gloomy weather, or if you've got brighter conditions, then you would do it right at the end of the day when you've got sunset and then dusk, and then even darker than that. Obviously, this shot is taken looking down straight onto the water from above. So no need for any sort of neutral density graduated filters to darken any sky. But in the next picture, that's exactly what we've done. I'm shooting across the tops of the water towards the sea, taken at sunset. Again, it's a relatively fast shutter speed. It's 0.8 of a second. Again, the same as the previous shot. And looking right into the lights, I've used, as I say, a neutral density graduated filter to darken the top half of the picture, the sky, while keeping the sea pretty much as it was, without using the natural ambient light that's there. And the 0.8 seconds of exposure have enabled me to catch this wave as it comes in over the rocks, and it's given me sort of a real sense of the wave spray flying up into the air. Had I used sort of 10 seconds or something like that, had I waited a little bit longer after sunset, then this would have been completely blurred out, and it would have been a very milky sort of shot with the wave quite invisible. But at 0.8 of a second, the wave is still visible, and so is the spray that's flying over the rock. So you take your pick with the kind of shot you want to get. As the sun is going down, there's enough light to be able to use a relatively fast shutter, as I say, shutter speed 0.8 a second, so we can see the wave, see the spray flying over the rock. Wait another half an hour or so, and the sun is well below the horizon, we're into dusk. Use a longer exposure of 10-15 seconds, to say, and all these waves would completely blur out. We wouldn't see the spray here. We would just see sort of a milky mist on the water in front of us here, which would, perfectly attractive too. And again, as I mentioned just now, if you've got a really gloomy day, bad weather, then you can do this actually in the middle of the day as well. This clearly isn't Devon or Cornwall. This is the south coast of Iceland on a very dull, gloomy day, and able to use a shutter speed that's slow enough to blur the movement of the water. This is a fifth of a second or 0.2 of a second, so rather faster than the last couple of exposures. So we blurred the moving water, but we've really got this sort of what I call shards of glass. So you can see the sort of the waves doing that, spraying up in front of us as lines of water. So we can still see the waves clearly, and we still see the spray very clearly in this very action-packed, very dramatic, very dynamic movement of water coming up into the air. Again, I've used a neutral density graduated filter to darken the top half of the sky to make it even more moody, and also to help brighten the water a little bit. So we've got what appears to be quite a nice, not maybe nice stormy day, but a very active stormy day with the waves crashing in onto these lumps of ice on the seashore. And as I said, sometimes you can't always be able to do this in the middle of the day. It's sometimes a little bit too bright, or even at the end of the day, as shot here, you want to really slow down the shutter speed a lot to actually get the milky effect. And although these are taken at sunset with low light levels falling away, I've nevertheless used here a neutral density filter, which covers the whole of the lens, not just part of it to darken the sky. I'm actually darkening everything, so reducing the amount of light getting into the camera using what's called a stopper. So this is a square or rectangular filter that fits over the front of the lens, and with sort of foam matting on the inside of it to actually grip the filter holder, so there's no chance of any light leaking around behind it and spoiling the effect. It's really darkening the light with no light leaking in, so darkening the whole picture. So this now, although the sun is still shining, this is now down to 8-second exposure. So the waves coming in here on the South Devon coast here completely blurred out, and we've got a nice milky effect. Not as milky as in that shot on the North Devon coast or on the Metallic on the West Cornwall coast, because the waves here are much smaller. But nevertheless, we're getting a fairly nice milky effect with the waves disappearing and just sort of becoming an even blur across the whole surface, even though we're still sort of at least half an hour or so before the sunset itself. Okay, so that's kind of an introduction to water in terms of the sea. And I'm going to look at a few shots of rivers, and it's the same kind of idea again of a river. This is on Dartmoor, river flowing over rocks, and again using a relatively fast shutter speed, a sixth of a second. So it's taken in the middle of the day, but because the water is flowing really quite fast, a sixth of a second is quite enough to blur it. And although it's blurred, you can still see the water, still see the individual amounts of water moving very fast. And you've got spray flying up here in this sort of miniature shards of glass, and up here as well. So it really has a real sense of energy and dynamism. And the pattern of the water coming in over the rocks themselves is actually sort of a part of the pattern of the whole picture. So that is kind of the picture itself, is the pattern that this flowing water creates. Contrast this with this kind of shot where the water is completely blurred out. This is another river on Dartmoor. The water is flowing around this one single rock in the middle of the river, and I've used a very long exposure time, 6 seconds, to actually just completely blur the water out. We now have a sort of really nice, soft, silky, it's almost dreamy effect around the rock. And of course, you can use this kind of effect to actually really isolate your subject. Those of you who've been on my courses will know that I talk about keeping your subject simple and having nothing competing with for attention with the surrounding negative space. Well, one way to do that is to completely isolate your subject, as here, with nothing around it at all. And done that by actually blurring the water completely out. And you've got lots of white water around it, which will be bubbling and foaming and giving us lots of sort of perhaps distracting detail. But by using this long exposure, the water is really blurred out to this beautiful silken effect. So it's 6 seconds long. I've only used f9 because I didn't really want the exposure to go too long. It was already getting quite dusk-like down in this forest setting, and it was getting quite dark in the forest. So didn't use too long in exposure because I didn't really need a huge depth of field. As long as the camera focused on this rock here, which it has, that's all that needed to be sharp. Everything else is completely blurred out due to the long exposure with the water. Now I'm just going to show you two pictures which are rather a pair. Again, a Dartmoor stream with water flowing around the rocks. This is a quarter of a second, so it's really blurring out quite nicely, but it's still, the running water is still visible. So it's not completely blurred out into the silken sheet of the previous shot. The flowing water is still visible. And so that's a quarter of a second, f22, so the lens aperture is shut down as far as it will go, and ISO of 100. So I'm really trying to limit the amount of light getting into the lens so I can get this slow shutter speed to actually blur the moving water. Contrast this with the identical picture, but where I've used a very fast shutter speed to actually to freeze the water. So you've got this water suspended as it comes over the waterfall. A lot of people ask me, isn't it better to actually photograph these rivers in such a way that you freeze the movement of the water? And sometimes it is. Personally, I usually prefer that, the shot where you actually blurred the water, but sometimes you can do this, and sometimes it works, or usually it will work if you can come in close to the water, such as I have here, so you can actually really see the droplets of water frozen as they come in over the little rapids and the little waterfall, if you like. But to do that, you really pay a bit of a price. To get this water to freeze like this, I've had to use 1,000th of a second. It's no good using the sort of standard sort of shutter speed of a 60th or 125th of a second as you might normally do. That is nowhere near fast enough to freeze the movement of this kind of water because it's moving an awful lot faster than you realize. So 1,000th of a second has frozen the movement of the water. But to make that possible in this sort of forest setting on a cloudy day when there's really not much light, I've had to use an ISO of 1250 and with an f setting lens aperture of f5. So the lens aperture is wide open, so getting quite a small depth of field. As you can see here, the water back here is blurring out. So a relatively small depth of field. So not all the picture is sharp by a long way, but just this main area where your attention is drawn. And it's ISO of 1250. You're risking making the picture rather grainy, but that's not showing up in this picture, so that's okay. But there is a bit of a price to pay and a risk you're taking in this kind of shot of having to use a very fast shutter speed, is then you have to use a very high ISO and have the lens aperture wider open than perhaps you might normally like. But it's, in this instance, I think it's worked to compare. I'm not saying which is better or which is worse. I know this is my personal favorite, but this one also works quite well as well. All right, going to move away from water now onto other areas, and so staying in nature, but sort of close-ups, how you can use the blurred effect to actually create some artistic sort of images. This is a sort of image you might normally want to create of autumn leaves, peach colors in the autumn, again on Dartmoor, really a static shot in the sense that I've managed to photograph it with little or no wind. Managed to shot this with at an 1/8 of a second and f7.1, so the lens aperture is fairly wide open, so the depth of field is not sharp, not huge, as most of the picture is a little bit blurred in the background here, but these leaves in this area and in this area are sharp, so your attention is drawn into this part of the picture, which is good because that's the area that's sharp. And that's the sort of the static kind of view you might often aim to try to achieve. However, on days when there's a fair bit of wind, you might sort of end up rather giving up and surrendering to the inevitable. Say, well, then we'll go with this kind of thing and make it a rather an abstract artistic kind of shot. I should say this is not actually the same view as in the previous picture. They were taken in different years, not just different locations, but different years. But they make an interesting comparison that on a windy day you can really struggle to get those sharp pictures, and sometimes it's better just to give up and go with the flow and really create something that's rather artistic and abstract, and just go with the blur, you might say. So this is a 1 second exposure, f14. So I have to shut down the lens aperture rather more in order to enhance the actual or lengthen the shutter, lengthen the exposure time in order to get an even greater blur, so that the lenses of these leaves are really blurring out and creating this really quite abstract pattern. Same kind of thing in the next picture as well, where trying to photograph a field of ripening rice in China. And it was quite a windy day, and I really could not get a shot where the rice was static. So I thought, oh, well, never mind, go with the flow and do a shot where where you use the blur to create something which is a little bit artistic and which is atmospheric and dynamic as well. So that's what I've gone for here. The exposure time is 1/4 of a second at f8, so lens aperture is fairly wide open. Didn't want to go for too long an exposure. Didn't want the rice to blur out too much, but it's sufficiently windy that the rice is blowing around to actually give us enough blur to make it interesting and make it relatively abstract, but without taking away, without sort of destroying what it actually is. You can see clearly what it is. So then we're going to move on to a little bit of wildlife and blur in wildlife photography, deliberate blur in wildlife photography. We have plenty of accidental blurs in wildlife photography, that's for sure, but this is a deliberate one. And we actually have two different types of blur in this picture, which we'll talk about. And this, as you can see, is an oyster catcher in flight, taken at Bouncy Island in Poole Harbour. And what I've done here is the camera is, or the lens is focused on the bird's head and bill, so that's nice and sharp. But its wings are flapping so fast that they're blurred. They're not blurred because they're out of focus. They're blurred because they're moving so fast. And then the water is blurred as well. Not because it's out of focus, but because the camera is panning with the bird, or I'm panning the camera to try to keep up with the bird. And so we got this horizontal blur, which sort of parallels the waves in many ways as well. To actually blur out that water as well, and really make sure, or help to make sure that the bird's head remains sharp, which is the critical part of the picture to actually get a sharp picture of the bird's body. The details are, this is I use a 200th of a second exposure time and f20. So I've deliberately had a really quite a narrow lens aperture in order to maximize the depth of field in case the camera wasn't able to lock onto this bird as well as I might like. And that has actually proved to be quite useful, because although this shot is completely sharp, because the camera has locked onto it, in a few other pictures it didn't work quite so well, but I did manage to get them sharp enough. 200th of a second, you might say, well, I could have used a faster shutter speed in order to get these wings sharp, but I'm quite happy with the wings blurring out as they flap. Obviously, if I use a significantly faster shutter speed in order to try and sharpen that, then I would have had to have put the ISO up quite a bit, because I couldn't close the lens aperture down much more. The ISO I used is quite low, it's 160th of a second. Sorry, ISO is 160. So it's still quite low, which means I don't have too much grain in the picture. I could have put it up to 500 or 600, so I could have used a faster shutter speed here. But I quite like the blur in the wings, actually, and although I didn't really know I was going to get that when I was doing the shot. But 200th of a second seemed to be fast enough to capture the bird in flight, as long as the lens was able to keep panning with the bird and stay focused on the bird's head. So that's a shot with two different kinds of focus, two different kinds of blur imposed in the same picture. And it is something really quite extraordinary, almost abstract, a little bit difficult to grasp and just decide whether it's worked or not. This is a shot taken at dusk, looking into the setting sun, of a nightjar taking flight, taken just last week, actually, near Teignmouth in South Devon, and use a flash is fired to actually try and light up the bird against the light of the sky. And yes, the bird's body is not especially sharp, but the wing here is. So the flash has hit this wing just as it's flapping this way. And that's, the focus has gone onto that wing as well, and the light has caught it just right. Everything else is a bit blurred, but that wing is right, so that makes me happy enough. And then we got a shadow of the wing here with the wing flapping, but without the flash having fired. So what we got here is, because the exposure time is a 60th of a second, so relatively fast for this time of the evening, f4, so the lens aperture is wide open, and a very high ISO, 3200. So the picture does have a certain amount of grain in it. I managed to remove most of it in post-photography processing. What this shadow is because the flash gun fires for only 1,000th of a second, so it's much faster than the shutter, than the lens's shutter, the camera's shutter. So you get, first of all, the flash gun lights up the wing, and then you get, and then for most of the remaining 60th of a second, you get the wing, a shadow of the wing as it moves without any flash on it. So you get a blur in the wing movement. So you get a sharp path of the wing, and then you get a blur in the wing as it moves. So you get a sort of a very dynamic sense of the bird in flight. This is a work in progress. I shall be going back up to this heath over the next week or two, or a couple of weeks, to try and redo this and improve on it. But that's the kind of idea of shooting with a flash in low light. It has to be done in low light for this bird because nightjar, as you can tell by its name, is actually a nocturnal bird. So you can't photograph it in flight during the daytime, unfortunately. So anyways, that's wildlife, and I'm going to move on really to the classic blurred motion sort of shot, the traffic. It's a very simple thing to do, really. Is you just need a shot in the evening, put your camera on a tripod, and hopefully have lots of traffic moving at quite high speed, and just use a fairly long exposure. This one was taken at 5 seconds, f11, 100 ISO. And you see we've taken at dusk with quite a bit of light still in the sky. That's deliberate. I wouldn't really want to shoot this kind of thing after it's got completely dark, because if I did, then the whole of the top half of the picture would be completely black and wouldn't be able to see the hillside really. Just the lights would tell me that the land is there. And so it would not be anything like as atmospheric. I think this is a much moodier shot to have light in the sky, and then just use this 5-second exposure to blur out the traffic as it piles by. Obviously red lights for the cars' rear lights and white lights for the cars' headlights, and just this really nice curve taking it through the picture. Sorry, I hit the wrong button there. Take the really nice curve as the road goes through the picture here. It's much easier, of course, to do this kind of thing in autumn or winter when it gets dark nice and early, so you can photograph the rush hour traffic as it's getting dark. It's difficult to do it this time of year because by the time it gets dark, it's getting pretty late, and there's not a great deal of traffic on the road unless you're in the middle of a big city, in which case then you might still be able to do it. But continuing with the same kind of theme, a shot taken in the middle of Exeter again at dusk with lots of light still in the sky. A bus zipping across in front of the camera just as I take a shot of the department store in the middle of Exeter. I did it deliberately. This is not an accident. It didn't just happen to get a bus in the way as I was taking the shot. Without the bus there, it would be a very static and rather boring picture of this building, and we'll also have a lot of empty tarmac in the foreground as well, which would be rather unsightly. Having deliberately waited for this bus to drive through, so that puts this zip of beautiful colored blurred light coming through the picture and conveniently hides most of the tarmac for me. Well, not all of it, there's still some of it visible, but most of it's gone, and the attention is drawn away from the tarmac into the lights from this bus. So the exposure time on this is 1 second, taken at f/8. So the bus is going not incredibly fast, but it's fast enough to really blur out quite nicely and give us this kind of sense of energy and movement, and to really sort of set a fairly energetic scene. This has actually been used on the cover of a magazine, which is rather nice. So that's nice to know that a magazine editor approved of the picture as well. Anyway, then there's this shot I've inserted here, which shows a very different kind of urban night lighting. That's the London Eye. It looks like the London Eye is zipping around at huge speed, completely blurred out, but actually it's moving along at its normal snail pace. It's just that the shutter is also going at a snail pace as well. Round about 10 seconds, 10 seconds with the lens aperture closed right down to stop, well, because we've got quite a bit of light in the dusk sky still. So 10 seconds f/16, 100 ISO of 100. So 10 seconds. Even the London Eye in 10 seconds moves a fair distance. So you're really managing to get the whole eye blurring out quite nicely, and that really shows up like this, which I say it looks like it's really powering around really fast. You can do this kind of thing with just about any big wheel anywhere in the world. Just have to be sort of patient and take a long exposure of the wheel as it moves around at a very slow speed. And then I'll just come back to the shot that I introduced this talk with, the shot taken in Shanghai a couple of years ago. Obviously no sky visible in this shot. I'm actually looking down from a footbridge above, so just purely all of road, and at a junction on a roundabout, so I've got lights coming in from at least two directions and giving me a nice bit of a diagonal and diagonals from two directions, and then a bit of a curve as the lights come around here, and really just more or less just the red lights of the car's tail lights, just a little bit of white here from this car's headlights here. And I really find this, I always find this really fascinating, energetic, dynamic shot. There are quite a few pictures in this series. I took quite a number standing on this bridge, but this is the one I like most, partly because of this poor solitary cyclist in the middle here, wondering if he's going to survive the evening. But this is the kind of thing that you can do in most cities. It's really, as long as you get a good viewpoint, it's a great dynamic kind of shot. And we're going to move on from there and come to a couple of people pictures. And here, this one, fairly simple shot of a brewer at work in a microbrewery, emptying a sack of barley into a hopper. And it's camera's handheld. If you use a flash, which is balanced against the ambient light, which is quite low, there's not much light, it's quite dark, but I use a flash to balance against the ambient light. You see the sack here is really quite white because there's a shaft of light coming from the roof above, and then the flash has lit up his face and his clothes here to actually help to counter the bright light on the sack. But so this part of the picture, but it's still allowed for quite a bit of blur in the barley as it pours out of the sack, and that really gives to me the sense of energy and movement, and also in his hands and this part of the sack as he lifts the sack up to try and make sure it gets emptied. So the shutter speed here is a 13th of a second. So with the flash fired, and the flash obviously, as I said, fires for just a 1,000th of a second. So most of the exposure is taken with no flash firing. It's just really right at the beginning of the exposure, the flash fires, lights him up, and then the rest, for most of the 13th of a second, it's just exposing the rest of the picture to actually get the correct exposure, and then you see then the moving barley is quite blurred because of that. Very much a tourist kind of picture now. This is a nightclub on the south coast of Turkey. This is the sort of shot I've ended up doing quite a lot of when I was shooting a couple of years ago for Dorling Kindersley guidebooks and such projects. You end up in weird and wonderful places like this. And obviously with management's permission, it's actually taken with a tripod. I was able to create enough space around me in the nightclub to actually use a tripod. No flash, just using whatever lighting the nightclub delivers at the moment that I shoot. The exposure time is 2 seconds, and the light that's delivered, of course, we've got a laser, which is giving me a really nice sort of dynamic and energetic sort of lighting, and a wonderful green light on the sides of the people. 2 seconds, of course, everybody's moving, so it's quite nicely blurred, which actually has a double function, really, from the point of view of the professional photographer and the publisher as well. The first sort of purpose, of course, is to actually give us a sense of energy and movement, and people are sort of having a good time, etc. The second purpose is to make sure that everybody, as far as possible, is unidentifiable. So if you're going to publish a shot like this, big publishers get nervous about people being identifiable in their shots in their books. So this kind of shot helps to actually make sure they're not identifiable, and that's something which works out quite nicely, gives us a nice atmospheric picture as well. So that's 2 seconds. If you can go a little bit further, and then you produce something really quite abstract. This is a nightclub in Hong Kong. A lot of people don't like this picture. I love it. For a lot of people, it's just too abstract, but I love it because of that. And I've had this picture for quite a number of years, and I still wheel it out from time to time to show sort of the blurred abstraction of this picture in the nightclub. And again, I haven't used any kind of flash. It's just using whatever ambient light the nightclub delivers up at the moment that I shoot. It's for 4 seconds. Camera on a tripod again, managed to carve out enough space in the nightclub. You have to be careful not to have too long an exposure. You have to be careful where you set the tripod up as well, because there's always the risk that the floor might be vibrating or moving. But in this instance, it's pretty solid base and not happening too much. So you really have a sort of nice abstract kind of shot where just about everybody is not identifiable. Even these people up at the top are not really identifiable. So it's a nice sort of moody atmospheric shot, which really sets the scene in this nightclub image. And then the final, actually not quite the final people, not quite the final people picture, but in this set, I know I've shown this one before, but this is again one of my sort of favorite festival energy-packed pictures taken at the Ottery Tar Barrels Festival in East Devon, held every November, or every November during the normal sort of year anyway. And there's no flash fired with this one. It's just really just the light coming from the flames, which is the sole illumination in this shot, and a little bit of light coming from the shop in the background. I really like the way this is blurred. I know the shop is blurred because I'm trying to pan against the movement of the flaming barrel and the men here. The flames themselves and the sparks coming off, and most parts of the men are actually quite sharp, but the whole scene is sort of packed with energy and dynamism. And the background is blurred out partly because of focus, but largely because the camera is moving to keep up with these men as they run through the street. And without the flash, that shop is not lit up. One of the problems with using flash in this kind of situation is that you end up lighting up the shops behind you. So then you actually see all the business signs and the advertising signs and so on. And that really is a big distraction. If you don't want it in this kind of picture, you just want to concentrate on the energy and the dynamism and the power of this kind of action going on in the street. Again, it's not to everybody's taste, but for me, I think this is a really terrific sort of blurred shot. Okay, so the next couple of shots, don't adjust your set. This is real. There's a little bit of cartoon fun for you. Idea of capturing moving vehicles as a sort of vehicle that's partially visible, but then with blur coming out. Obviously, in cartoons, movement is usually represented in this kind of way. You've got the vehicle leaning forward as it's in a hurry to move along, and then you've got these lines coming out the back, and that's sort of represents the movement of the vehicle. Unfortunately, when you can do this kind of thing with flash photography using a flash gun in the evening as it's getting dark. Unfortunately, if you do it, fire the flash gun in the normal kind of way, what usually happens is that you've got the vehicle, but then the lines are coming out the front of the vehicle, and it looks like the vehicle is going backwards. Well, that's not really quite ideal. That's not really what you want. And the reason that happens is because, as I said already, the flash fires for a much shorter time than your shutter speed. So if you're shooting this kind of thing in the evening, you might use, say, 1/4 of a second or 1/10 of a second, something like that. But the flash only fires for 1,000th of a second, and it fires as the shutter opens. And so it fires at the beginning of the exposure, and then it's most of the exposure is taken without any flash. So you light up the vehicle first, and then as the vehicle moves from right to left, then you get this blur in front. So that's the problem, that you're getting the blur in the wrong place because the flash is firing at the beginning of the exposure. What you want to do in order to get this shot is to have the flash firing at the end of the picture, so that the vehicle moves through or scene during most of your sort of 1/4 second exposure, and then the flash, so moving from right to left towards the left here, and then the flash fires right at the end of the exposure and lights up the vehicle here. So then you've got the lines of movement behind the vehicle instead of annoyingly at the front. So that's what that is called, lining up, getting your flash to fire at the end of the picture is called rear curtain synchronization. And that's because the shutter actually consists of 2 curtains separated by a space. And what happens is that these 2 curtains, when you fire the shutter, the 2 curtains slide across in front of your sensor. The first curtain initially is covering the sensor, so it's not exposed, and as the 2 curtains slide across, then the space between them exposes the sensor, and then the second curtain comes across and closes shields the sensor, so the exposure is over with. And then once everything's shut down, then the exposure, then the curtains zip back across to the other side, ready for the next shot. So the flash is normally synchronized to fire with that first curtain, so at the beginning of the exposure. A good quality flash gun will have a button on it somewhere, actually for the rear curtain synchronization. So actually it fires as the second curtain comes across, so at the end of the exposure. So a lot of flash guns don't have that, but if you buy a good quality flash gun, it will have this button saying for rear curtain synchronization. You can find that if it's not marked clearly on the flash gun, then you can find it in the in the manual somewhere, hopefully. So anyway, I was looking around for pictures that sort of might illustrate this, because I have done this in the past, but I really couldn't find anything that illustrated it very well. So a couple of days ago, I collared my son to come out into our back garden to actually try and demonstrate this a little bit. And so here he is running across our garden, and this is with the flash firing in the normal way, with the flash synchronizing with the first curtain. And so here we are, he's running, the flash has caught him. The exposure time is 1/4 of a second, I believe. Yeah, no, 0.4 of a second. The exposure time is 0.4 of a second at 800 ISO. So the flash is fired with the shutter's first curtain, so at the beginning of the exposure, and then he's carried on running across. And for most of the exposure, there's no flash lighting, and you just get this blur coming out in front. So it looks a little bit weird. It looks like he's breathing out smoke or something like that. But if you then switch on rear curtain synchronization with the flash, you get this, which isn't actually showing all that well, but it's on the screen. But hopefully you can see it well enough to actually see that now he is running across the picture and he's got the blur behind him. And that's because, as I say, the flash is now firing with the second curtain, synchronized with the shutter's second curtain. So at the end of the exposure, and the first part of the exposure, there's no flash lighting, and he's just shown up as this blur coming across the screen, and then the flash fires, and then we caught him stationary here. So that's how the rear curtain synchronization works, and that's what one way to actually get these sort of blurred lines behind someone or something that is moving along relatively fast, and you want to have that sense of movement without having the damn blur coming out in front of them instead of behind. Anyway, then the final two pictures look at something completely different. Instead of blurring the motion of something that is moving, we blur something that is static, and we do that by moving the camera. So here we have something which is actually some nightclub lights on the street in Hong Kong. It's just a fairly ordinary shot of some nightclub lights, and then we just made these great lines of light here it's photographed with the zoom lens, and I've turned the zoom ring as the camera is exposing. So it's a sort of a 5-second exposure, and then I'm very carefully turning the zoom ring during that exposure. Obviously, you've got to do it very carefully, because you really don't want to move the camera in any way at all. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a bit of ghosting or blurring of the picture. So 5 seconds, f/8, and then just the lens is a 24 to 105 millimeter lens, and I'm just turning it from the 24 millimeter through to about 100, or all the way through to 105 during that 5-second exposure, and you get this fantastic lighting situation. I should actually show you the original picture where it's just shot static, but I haven't done that. Actually, that's an oversight. So we just have to show you the lights as they're flying along with the zoom. So that's something to bear in mind for the urban shots, especially. And then secondly, where you actually move the camera, you have sort of what you might call pouring lights. So here again in Hong Kong, street lights in Hong Kong, and I've actually got the camera on a tripod, and I actually just move the camera in a downward arc, like downwards, as you're saying, and comes out in this sort of pouring light situation, which turns a very static scene, very nicely brightly lit, but nevertheless static scene, into this sort of scene of pouring light. So that's kind of another sort of idea for actually creating sort of dynamic, energetic pictures from a scene that is otherwise quite static. So that really is kind of the talk that I was going to give about blurred motion photography. Really just the usual thing to finish off. Firstly, the nigelhicks.com websites. There's the usual books for sale there, and the workshops coming up in the autumn are all listed there. And then you can go around the photo galleries, and also you can watch the past talks. All the past talks are on the website and on my blog, and you can sign up for future talks as well. The next talk will be in September. There's not going to be a talk in August. I'm going to give myself a break, but 15th of September will be the next talk. Will be about storytelling through photography. So how to sort of tell a story with photography is the idea there, which is actually sort of one of the most important roles of photography. And then the other website, aquaterrapublishing.co.uk, which is now sort of become a general book and print store, online store. So gradually we're increasing the number of books there. This is not purely just my books. The NigelHicks.com website is selling only my books, but aquaterrapublishing.co.uk is selling an increasingly wide range of books by a whole host of authors, mostly about, almost entirely really about travel and nature within the UK. So aimed at sort of a staycation summer and staycation autumn as well, quite possibly, for finding out about travel and nature sites within the UK. And then also at the moment, the prints and greetings cards are all my stuff, but that will be expanded in due course as well. And at the moment, it's 10% off everything and free postage. That currently is only scheduled to last till the end of July, but I may actually extend that till August. So to go onto that site if you want to take a look and get anything. Anyway, so that's the end of this talk this evening. Thank you so much for coming along. I'm going to unshare my screen, and so if anybody has any questions, we can do that. If I can stop sharing, and then if anybody wants to ask any questions, then please do so. No, okay. If nobody's got any more questions, then I'm going to close it down for tonight, and so say thank you very much for coming along, and it's really great. Hope you have a terrific summer, and we'll see you in September. Well, autumn already it will be. So yeah. Hope you have a great summer, great August, and yeah, have a good time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nigel.
Thanks for tonight, Nigel.
You're all very welcome. Thanks. Bye. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.